Hi, friends! Today I will tell you a story about a boy and a girl named Max and Emma and their spooky encounter in the woods while camping. There was once a group of campers who set up their tents by a quiet lake, deep in the woods. It was the perfect place for camping. Tall trees stretched toward the sky, the air smelled fresh and clean, and the lake was calm and sparkling. The campers were a mix of kids and a few adults to help them out. But tonight, the grown-ups had gone to bed early, leaving the kids around the campfire. They were all a little too excited to sleep just yet. The fire crackled and glowed orange and yellow, casting warm light on everyone's faces. They were laughing, roasting marshmallows, and telling stories. It was the perfect way to end a long day of hiking, swimming, and playing. They'd already heard funny stories, a few spooky ones, and some stories about real animals in the woods. But now, as the fire got smaller and the night grew darker, everyone fell quiet. Then Emma, one of the campers, suddenly said, "Let's tell ghost stories." And her voice was just a bit too calm and a bit too quiet. The other campers looked around, noticing the shadows all around them for the first time. They looked at the dark trees stretching up like tall, silent giants against the starlit sky. And suddenly, everyone wanted to hear a story. One boy, Max, grinned and said, "I bet I know the scariest one." Max loved scary stories, but he was never really scared. He always said, "Ghosts aren't real," whenever anyone tried to frighten him. The others were curious to hear what Max might tell, but before he could say a word, Emma gave him a mischievous look. "This isn't a ghost story," she said slowly. "It's something else. Something even scarier than a ghost." She let her voice drop to a whisper. "It's a story about something that's supposed to live here, right here, in these woods." All the campers leaned in closer, hanging on every word. They say that in these woods, there's something called the Shadow Walker. It's not a ghost, but a creature that only comes out when it's really, really dark. It hides between the trees, moving so quietly that no one hears it coming. It doesn't leave footprints or make sounds. People who've seen it say it looks almost like a person, but it's different. Not human, not animal. Just a shadow with two hollow eyes, watching you. The fire seemed to flicker a little lower and the woods grew darker as Emma went on. The campers shivered, feeling chills that had nothing to do with the cool night air. Even Max, who wasn't afraid of anything, felt a strange prickling on the back of his neck. The crackling fire didn't feel so warm anymore, and each camper's shadow seemed to stretch farther, merging with the dark trees beyond. Emma continued in a hushed voice. "They say the Shadow Walker only appears if you're alone. If you're ever left by yourself, even for just a moment, it might find you. It watches from the trees, waiting. And then, if you're not careful, it gets closer and closer until..." She suddenly made a quick, shadowy grab at Max, and he jumped, almost spilling his marshmallow into the fire. Everyone laughed, trying to shake off the scary feeling, though their laughter sounded a little shaky. Max laughed the hardest. "It's just a story," he said, louder than he needed to. "Ghosts and shadows can't walk. They're just shadows." But the prickling feeling didn't quite go away. After Emma's story, the campers stayed up a little while longer, but the spooky feeling clung to them, like the faint smell of smoke that stayed on their clothes after a campfire. They talked about other things, trying to lighten the mood. Soon the fire died down, and one by one, the kids climbed into their tents. But Max lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest. Usually he loved the sounds of crickets and the soft hooting of owls, but tonight everything felt different. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps, and every shadow outside the tent seemed to be watching. At last, Max couldn't take it anymore. He was thirsty, and he knew the water jug was just outside his tent. If he didn't get a drink, he'd never fall asleep. Trying not to make a sound, he crept out of his sleeping bag, unzipped the tent as quietly as he could, and peered into the dark. The night was colder than he'd expected, and the trees loomed over him, looking even taller and darker than they had around the campfire. Shadows seemed to gather at their bases, like deep pools of darkness. He quickly grabbed the water jug and took a big gulp, hoping it would help him relax. But as he lowered the jug, he saw something. Between the trees, he thought he saw a shadow. But this wasn't a normal shadow. It was darker than the rest, almost like a thick black shape standing still in the darkness. It looked like it was shaped like a person. Max squinted, telling himself it was just his imagination. Shadows couldn't walk. Shadows weren't real. But then the shadow moved. Max's heart pounded and he froze in place, gripping the water jug so hard his fingers hurt. He wanted to call out, but his voice wouldn't come. It was as if the night itself was swallowing his words. Just then, another camper, Jake, stumbled out of his tent, yawning and rubbing his eyes. He looked at Max, confused. "What are you doing?" Max felt a rush of relief, but he only managed to whisper. "Did you see that?" Jake squinted into the woods. "See what?" "There was something out there," Max whispered, his voice shaky. "It was just standing there, watching." Jake looked around but shrugged. "I think you're seeing things. That story was just a joke, Max. There's no such thing as the Shadow Walker." Max took a shaky breath and nodded. Maybe he was just tired. He climbed back into his tent and tried to sleep. The next morning, he tried to laugh it off with the others. "I was just tired," he told them. "Shadows don't walk." But that night, as everyone went to bed, Max found himself wide awake again, listening for any strange sounds. And again, he thought he saw a shadow, moving just beyond the firelight. This time, he wasn't alone. Emma, who had told the story, also saw it. "Did you see that?" she whispered to him, her voice barely above a breath. "Max, do you see it?" Max nodded, his eyes wide with fear. The shadow was there again, dark and still between the trees. And this time, it didn't disappear when they looked at it. It stood there, watching them. Max and Emma huddled closer, together, too afraid to move. They knew they should run, wake up the adults, or do something. But they felt frozen. Then, something strange happened. The shadow took a slow, silent step forward, gliding between the trees without a sound, with only those empty, hollow eyes fixed on them. Max finally found his voice and whispered, "What do we do?" Emma didn't answer. She looked just as scared as he felt. But she grabbed his hand, and together, they backed up toward the campsite. The shadow followed, slipping forward silently. They couldn't see its face, but they felt its gaze, cold and hollow. Just as they reached the edge of the camp, one of the adults stirred and turned on a flashlight, shining it into the woods. The beam of light swept over the shadow, and for a moment, Max thought he saw something real, not just a shadow. He thought he saw a tall figure with hollow eyes, its face hidden in shadows, moving just like a person. But the light seemed to scare it, and it slipped back into the trees, vanishing like smoke. In an instant, it was gone, leaving only the empty, quiet forest behind. The next morning, Max and Emma told the adults, but no one believed them. "Just a story, kids," they said. "You let it get into your heads." But Max and Emma knew what they had seen. And from that night on, whenever they heard a rustling in the woods or caught a glimpse of a shadow that didn't belong, they remembered the hollow-eyed figure in the trees.